Chapter 1. The telegram from Edinburgh. It was on the morning of the 4th of October, in the year 1895, that I awoke in our lodgings at 221 B. Baker Street to find my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes already seated by the hearth, fully dressed, and deeply absorbed in the contemplation of a telegram that had evidently arrived not long before. The fire crackled with an early autumn briskness, though the air beyond the window remained unusually mild. I had scarcely spoken my morning greeting when Holmes turned toward me with a peculiar light in his eyes, a glimmer I had come to recognize as the herald of an engaging case. "Come now, Watson," said he, tapping the telegram against the arm of his chair. "Pack your valise. We are bound for Edinburgh." "Scotland?" I asked, still rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "On whose summons?" Holmes handed me the telegram with a half-smile that hinted at the thrill of the chase already looming in his mind. The pale blue slip bore the official stamp of the Scottish Constabulary and read, "Urgent request, immediate presence, stop mysterious death. At Calton Hill Observatory, stock deceased is Sir Arthur Dunbrake's stop case. Contains elements of delicacy and possible political significance. Stop Balmoral Hotel Inspector Angus Forth. Stopey, reread the name, Sir Arthur Dunbrake." It was familiar, though I could not immediately place it. Holmes was already on his feet, striding across the room to retrieve his traveling cloak and the slender black case that held his investigative tools. "You recall Sir Arthur?" He prompted, as if plucking the thought from my mind. "Ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the Russo-Turkish tension, later an advisor to Her Majesty's Office for Foreign Relations. A discreet figure, though hardly unremarked in diplomatic circles. I remember now," I said. "He gave a series of lectures at the Royal Geographical Society last year, something about ancient Near Eastern artifacts." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Just so. And now he is dead, under peculiar circumstances atop Edinburgh's most symbolic hill in a locked observatory. A man like Dunbrake does not die quietly without reason. I assume Lestrade has already attempted the matter?" Holmes smirked faintly. "Lestrade is many things, but never eager to venture into Scottish jurisdiction. No, this comes directly from Inspector Angus Forth, a man I met briefly during the Milverton affair. Steady, unimaginative, but thorough. Within 2 hours we were seated in a northbound train, the countryside of England giving way to the mist-cloaked hills and smoky rooftops of the Scottish lowlands. Holmes passed much of the journey in silence, perusing a folded copy of the Scotsman, the leading Edinburgh daily, while I attempted with limited success to locate any public mention of Sir Arthur's demise. The newspaper bore no reference to a death, let alone one of a high-profile figure. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "A man of Sir Arthur's stature dies, and the press remains utterly silent. Either the coroner has delayed his report, which is unlikely, or someone with influence has chosen to suppress the story entirely. Political delicacy, as the telegram hinted." "Undoubtedly. And political delicacy, Watson, is often a veil for something far more disturbing." By late afternoon we arrived at Waverley Station, the familiar skyline of Edinburgh unfurling before us, a city of contrast and mood, with its sharp stone spires and twisting alleys, its enlightenment, grandeur, and Gothic gloom coexisting in perfect tension. The fading sun cast long shadows across Calton Hill, which loomed above the east end of Prince's Street like a crown of antiquity. its monuments silhouetted against a bruised sky. We were met at the Balmoral Hotel by Inspector Angus Forth himself, a tall, stoic Scotsman in a woolen overcoat, with copper-threaded hair and deep lines etched about the eyes. He greeted Holmes with a firm handshake and acknowledged me with a professional nod before ushering us into a private sitting room at the rear of the hotel. "I appreciate your coming on such short notice, Mr. Holmes," Forth began without preamble. "The matter is, as the telegram indicated, sensitive." "Tell me everything," Holmes said, lowering himself into a leather armchair. "Begin with the facts. Spare nothing, however insignificant it may seem." Forth nodded and retrieved a folded sheaf of notes. "The deceased, Sir Alistair Dunbrake, was found yesterday morning inside the Calton Hill Observatory. He had been granted special permission to use the facility for private astronomical studies, or so he claimed. The key to the observatory was held by the caretaker, a Mr. Malcolm Pender, who opened the building at first light and discovered the body." Holmes raised a finger. "The room, was it secured?" "Bolted from the inside," Forth replied. "Windows locked as well. No sign of forced entry." Sir Alistair was seated at the primary telescope, fully clothed, and, to all appearances, had simply expired where he sat. There was no wound, no blood, not even a mark upon his skin. "And the expression?" Forth grimaced. His face, it was twisted in horror, as though he'd seen the devil himself. Holmes was silent. For a moment, fingers steepled, his gaze distant. Then he asked, "Was a post-mortem performed?" "An initial examination was done by Dr. Fenwick of the city coroner's office. He found no sign of poison or trauma. Cause of death is listed for now as extremis due to shock, though from what, no one can say." "And the deceased's personal effects?" "A sealed notebook locked in a drawer beside the telescope. We've brought it here." "And this?" Forth produced a small envelope and handed it to Holmes. A single slip of paper was found in Sir Alistair's coat pocket. No handwriting, just a strange symbol like an eye or a crescent. Dr. Fenwick had never seen the like. Holmes studied the mark with sharp concentration. I could see the intensity growing behind his features, the subtle transformation that took hold of him whenever he smelled the scent of a riddle worth his mind. "There is something almost occult about this symbol," he said. "It echoes certain pre-Islamic carvings I encountered in Cairo. But that's a tenuous link, and I'll not speculate further without evidence." "What else?" Forth hesitated. "There are whispers, Mr. Holmes. I don't lend much to gossip, but the locals have their stories. They say the observatory is haunted, that men have seen lights flickering within at night, that voices echo from the hilltop when no soul is near." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ghost stories? Always a promising start." The sun had dipped low by the time we accompanied Inspector Forth up the winding paths to Calton Hill. The observatory stood like a sentinel at the edge of the summit, its domed roof catching the last glint of dying light. From that elevation, one could see all of Edinburgh, from the castle down to the Firth of Forth, where ships moved like beetles across the grey water dot inside. The observatory was cold and sterile. The great telescope loomed at the center of the room like a cannon pointed toward heaven. Holmes moved silently through the space, examining every detail, the tracks in the dust, the drawer latch, the creaking wood beneath the floorboards. It "Is often in what is not present that one finds the truth," he murmured. "There are no papers scattered, no signs of study, no books opened, and yet we are meant to believe Sir Alister was in deep astronomical thought." He crouched and ran his gloved fingers along the base of the telescope. "There, recently, polished. Why would only this part show signs of cleaning?" I glanced at Forth. "Do you suppose someone tampered with it?" "Or used it," Holmes said, rising slowly, "for something other than stargazing." As we stepped back into the evening air, the city below had turned to flickering gold. The gas lamps along Prince's Street gleamed like jewels, and a fine mist was beginning to rise off the rooftops. Holmes stood still for a moment, looking back at the observatory. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of a man, alone in a locked room, who dies of terror with no apparent cause?" I considered it. A man tormented by guilt, or confronted with some dreadful memory? "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perhaps he saw something that should not exist." He turned his collar against the wind and descended the hill without another word. Chapter 2. The ciphered notebook. The following morning, we breakfasted in the dining room of the Balmoral Hotel, where Holmes toyed absently with a slice of toast, while his mind clearly devoured far weightier fare. I had known him long enough to recognize that particular silence. Not the silence of indifference, but a furious deduction, inwardly devouring 100 thoughts and discarding 99 before speaking. "You have something?" I finally said. Chapter 11. A singular portrait. The journey back to the Calton Hill estate that evening was one undertaken in near total silence. Holmes, seated with his arms folded tightly and his eyes half-lidded, seemed submerged in private calculation. I did not interrupt. There was in his posture a familiar intensity, his body still, but his mind turning over facts with the precision of clockwork. From the faint twitch of his fingers to the occasional compression of his lips, I knew that something he had observed at the solicitor's office had stirred the cogs of his brilliant machinery into motion. When we arrived, the skies above Edinburgh were bruised purple, and the wind cut with a sharper edge. Calton Hill loomed with its classical monuments silhouetted in the twilight, while Sir Alister's home stood like a brooding sentinel beneath the gloom, its upper windows reflecting no light. We were met not by the butler, but rather by Lady Catherine, who greeted us in the drawing-room, her features composed yet marked with fatigue. "My cousin, Inspector Gregor, has taken his leave," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the east-facing study. "He said he'd return in the morning for another round of questioning. I confess, gentlemen, that this business is taking its toll, not merely on my nerves, but on the very fabric of our household. Fergus barely eats. Lucinda hasn't emerged from her chamber since morning." Holmes inclined his head, a glimmer of sympathy in his expression. "Your resilience, Lady Catherine, is admirable under such strain. Might I ask you a somewhat delicate question?" Her shoulders straightened. "Of course. Would it be possible," he asked with almost conversational detachment, "for Dr. Watson and me to examine the late Sir Alister's private collection, particularly his library, paintings, and personal correspondence?" A flicker crossed her eyes unease. "Perhaps, or caution. That's a significant request." "I assure you," Holmes said gently, "we are not seeking to cause further distress. But I believe your husband's collection may hold a key, however slight, that might lead us closer to the truth. Even a misfiled letter or misattributed Painting can whisper secrets when placed under scrutiny. Lady Catherine studied him a moment longer, then exhaled. Very well. I shall unlock his study, but please handle everything with care. Alistair curated his library with reverence. Holmes gave a respectful nod, and we followed her through a passage flanked by oil portraits of ancestors whose stern eyes watched us with eternal judgment. The study door yielded with a click, and she left us with a single admonition. Leave the past undisturbed, unless you're certain it can be trusted to speak honestly. Inside, the air was heavy with pipe smoke, dust, and old vellum. A Turkish rug spread out across the dark oak floor. The walls were lined with books rows upon rows of spines and gold leaf, many of them on ancient Scottish law, art provenance, and medieval history. A globe stood near the window, its countenance faded from years of sun, but it was the portrait over the mantelpiece that drew Holmes's eye immediately. "Watson," he said, stepping closer, "come here." It was a painting in oil, no more, than 2 feet high, depicting a young man in Highland dress, standing by a loch, the hills behind him capped in mist. But it wasn't just any young man, it was unmistakably Sir Alistair in his 20s. What struck us, however, was not the likeness, but rather the style. "This is no amateur work," Holmes murmured, narrowing his eyes. "Note the brushwork, see, the treatment of the light on the water, and the detailing on the folds of the tartan. This was done by someone trained, possibly even celebrated." I stepped closer. "Do you think it could be a Rayburn? A forgery, perhaps?" Holmes's eyes twinkled. "You read my mind. But let's not leap to conclusions. The signature is concealed beneath the lower right corner's frame. I shall examine that presently. More pressing, however, who painted it? And why would such a valuable piece remain obscure, unacknowledged?" He moved to the nearby writing desk, its surface still neatly arranged with a quill, sealed envelopes, a pipe rest, and a worn ledger. Holmes began examining the papers with gloved hands. Within minutes, he unearthed a folder of correspondence bound with green ribbon. Many were routine letters to art dealers, invitations to exhibitions, receipts from gallery acquisitions. But one, dated 5 months prior, was folded separately and bore no envelope. "Alistair, I beg you, do not exhibit the portrait. You know why. You swore it would remain private. To display it would betray everything we agreed upon. E.R." Holmes's lips thinned. "E.R.," he said aloud. "The initials are frustratingly vague." "I wonder," I said slowly, "if the R could stand for Rutherford, perhaps Elizabeth Rutherford, the late sculptor?" "An appealing theory," Holmes said, "though she died nearly a decade ago. We must dig deeper." He turned next to the bookshelf nearest the fireplace. After several minutes of pulling titles, inspecting margins, and noting annotations, he plucked down a slim volume bound in green leather. Its spine read, "Art in Exile, Scottish Masters of the Hidden. Era. Curious," he muttered. "Privately published. Rare, only a dozen known copies." He flipped through the pages, stopping at a plate showing a figure in Highland garb again, almost identical to the portrait above. A name was written below, Edward Ravensby. "Ravensby," Holmes exclaimed. "A painter once entangled in scandal he vanished from public life after being accused of forging a series of Romantic-era portraits. Never convicted, but effectively ruined. You think he painted this one? I asked. Possibly. The style is a match. If so, Sir Alister may have knowingly acquired or even commissioned the work. The letter from E.R. aligns. He stood in silence for a moment, eyes scanning the walls, the desk, the floor. "Watson," he said, turning to me with a rare flicker of excitement, "we may be circling something more complex than a mere inheritance dispute. What if Sir Alister was protecting something, either his own secret or someone else's?" I frowned. But then why die under such mysterious circumstances? "That," Holmes replied gravely, "is the shadow we must still lift." We returned to the drawing room to find Fergus seated alone, cradling a decanter of whiskey. He looked up as we entered, his eyes bloodshot but alert. "You've been in my father's study," he said, not with anger but curiosity. Holmes inclined his head. "Yes, Lady Catherine gave us permission." Fergus exhaled and poured himself another. "Drink, then you'll know he had secrets." Holmes said nothing. He spent the last month of his life writing strange letters, burning others in the hearth. Locked himself in that room most nights. Sometimes he'd mutter, "Let the dead sleep, or they'll drag the living with them." What did he mean? I asked. Fergus only shrugged. My father was many things, stern, proud, shrewd. But I never thought he was afraid. Not until recently. Holmes stepped closer. "Mr. Abernathy, tell me, do you know the name Edward Ravensby?" The young man blinked. "Ravensby? That rings a bell. My father mentioned him once, years ago. Said he was a painter with the gift and the curse of genius." "Why?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "Because the past, Mr. Abernathy, has an uncanny way of lingering. Sometimes in oil, sometimes in ashes." Holmes looked up, the corner of his mouth twitching in satisfaction. "You observed, of course, the drawer from which Sir Alister's notebook was taken?" "Yes." "Locked and untouched apart from the book itself." "Precisely. But you may have missed what I found behind it. A hairline scratch beneath the lining, as if something had been hastily removed, or perhaps concealed." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out the leather-bound volume we had taken from the observatory the night before. It was compact, perhaps no larger than a prayer book. Its edges worn smooth from handling. Holmes laid it between us on the table, opened to the first page, and turned it to face me. Every leaf was filled with rows of handwritten symbols and numerals, some resembling dates, others odd sigils, not Greek, not Cyrillic, not anything I could immediately place. "It appears a cipher," I said, frowning. "Indeed, Watson, but not a common one. This is no military code nor diplomatic shorthand. The pattern is erratic, and yet there is a structure, columns of repetition, intervals of 4, and symbols matched consistently with paired numbers. It reminds me of a cipher I once encountered in Alexandria, derived from early Phoenician trade scripts." "You believe Sir Alister wrote this?" Holmes leaned back, eyes narrowed. "I do. The pen pressure, the precision of stroke. It is the work of a man accustomed to secrecy, a trained hand, no idle scribbler." At that moment, a knock came upon our door. It was Inspector Forth, trench-coated and brisk, who entered with a document tube tucked beneath one arm. "I have the preliminary coroner's report," he said, unscrewing the lid and handing us the paper within. As expected, no wounds, no poisons. The heart simply stopped. Natural causes, though Fenwick admits he cannot explain the terror etched across the man's face. Holmes scanned the sheet, then set it aside. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Sir Alister's current associations? Political or otherwise?" Forth considered. "He kept to himself these past months. Resigned his post at the Foreign Office some 6 weeks ago. According to his housekeeper, he'd grown increasingly paranoid. She claimed he would speak to no one, refused all correspondence, and began referring to his death in strange terms, saying the eye draws nearer, and the hill remembers." Holmes's brows rose. "Most curious, did he suffer from any illness, mental decline?" "None reported. Though his family has a history of melancholia, a brother institutionalized in 1871, I believe." Holmes turned toward me. "And yet the brother did not die of fear in a locked room?" Forth gave a tight nod. "That's not all. The Royal Observatory had no formal arrangement with Sir Alister. He submitted no written request to use the building, and the permission apparently came from someone higher up, unnamed." "A phantom clearance," Holmes murmured. "That speaks volumes." "There's more," Forth said. "Last night, a fire was reported in the basement archives of the Edinburgh University Library, a restricted wing where old government, travel documents, and foreign correspondences are stored. The fire was small, contained quickly, but several files were damaged. Coincidence? I asked. Holmes shook his head. "There are no coincidences in my experience, Watson, only connections not yet understood." Later that day, we ventured into Edinburgh's old town, our boots echoing along the cobblestones of the Canongate. Holmes had arranged a meeting with Professor Elric McCraith, an antiquarian linguist of some repute, and, as Holmes described him, one of the few men in Britain who could make sense of Sir Alister's cipher. McCraith greeted us in a cluttered study atop a narrow, winding stair. The scent of leather-bound tomes and dried ink filled the air. He was a tall man with spectacles so thick they distorted his already severe expression into one of perpetual scrutiny. "You say you've a ciphered text?" he said, adjusting his lenses as Holmes handed him the notebook. McCraith began flipping through the pages, his face tightening. This is not merely a cipher," he muttered. "This is a form of linguistic encryption I've only seen once before, in a manuscript unearthed from beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There are elements of Phoenician, yes, but also something older. Proto-Sumerian symbols, perhaps. You see this? This character predates cuneiform, and yet Sir Alister deciphered it. He must have had a key. Without one, the sequence is indecipherable. But this," McCraith jabbed a finger at the pages, "this is not the product of idle scholarship. These are invocations." "Invocations?" I echoed. McCraith looked up. "This is not a diary, Dr. Watson. It's a record of ritual acts, transcriptions of something ancient. These symbols," he tapped a set of repeating lines, "are said to summon visions." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And what, in your view, might such visions entail?" McCraith hesitated. "If I were a superstitious man, I would say madness. At the very least, an altered state of consciousness. But I suspect Sir Alister was searching for something buried, not just historically, but quite literally. Calton Hill has long been regarded as a place of ancient significance. Some say it sits atop forgotten catacombs older than the city itself. I shifted uncomfortably. Are we to believe he died in the midst of some occultist pursuit? I believe, said Holmes, standing, that someone wanted us to believe exactly that. That evening, as we walked the dim streets toward the hotel, the city cloaked in its customary fog, Holmes was unusually quiet. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of his Inverness cape, and the thin blade of his profile seemed etched more sharply against the haze. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you make of a man who writes in forgotten tongues, speaks of ancient eyes, and dies of fright in a locked tower?" I thought for a moment. A madman? Holmes's brow furrowed. Or someone who had come too close to something others wished forever buried. Do you suspect murder? I suspect design, Holmes said. Murder, perhaps, but murder executed with precision. A method we do not yet comprehend. That is far more dangerous than poison or knife. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. Tomorrow we shall pay a visit to Sir Alister's residence. I wish to see the environment in which a sane man turned mystic, and why someone would go to such. Elaborate lengths to silence him. We crossed Prince's Street in silence, the lights of the city flaring in the mist like distant stars. Somewhere behind us, Calton Hill stood black against the cloudy sky, its observatory dome gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I could not help but glance back toward it, and in that moment, I too felt the weight of unseen eyes. Chapter 3. They, Dunbrake residence, the next morning dawned pale and sullen, with a low mist clinging to the edges of the north bridge like a warm shawl. I had just finished tying my cravat when Holmes, who had been pacing the floor for a quarter hour in his dressing gown, abruptly halted and declared, "We go to Bellevue Crescent." Sir Alister's residence? Precisely. Fourth, secured access. I wish to inspect the late diplomat's surroundings before they are stripped bare by overzealous functionaries or sentimental heirs. If the key to this mystery lies anywhere, Watson, it lies within the patterns of his final days. The books he read, the letters he burned, the dust he disturbed. We took a cab across town to a quiet, genteel part of Edinburgh, where the houses stood tall and dignified behind wrought iron railings and trimmed hedges. Number 14 Bellevue Crescent was a sandstone structure of considerable charm. Its windows shuttered, its steps recently swept. A constable stood at the gate, and upon producing a note from Inspector Forth, we were permitted entry. Inside, the house felt both stately and stifled, a place where the air had not been moved freely for weeks. Heavy drapes muffled the morning light, and the parlor bore the scent of old paper, pipe tobacco, and something more elusive, of faint mineral tang, as of damp earth or rusted iron. Holmes moved quickly from room to room, eyes roving like searchlights. He made no notes, but I could see the cogs of analysis turning beneath his brow. He spent a great deal of time in the study, a narrow chamber lined with books in multiple languages, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin. There were scrolls and folios, many tagged with slips in Sir Alister's own neat hand. A globe stood in the corner, a faded Ottoman map pinned beside it. On the desk sat a silver inkstand, a lamp with a green glass shade, and an ivory letter opener shaped like a scimitar. An imperial mind, Holmes murmured, but not without obsession. He opened a drawer and extracted a sheaf of correspondence tied with black ribbon. The letters were personal, Some from family, others from colleagues, but one stood out. It was unsigned and written in an oddly formal script. To ascend is to see, but what is seen cannot be unseen. The angle of vision opens only once. Beware the mirror that reveals only shadow. Holmes handed the note to me and retrieved a magnifying lens from his pocket. No watermark, he said. Cheap paper. Ink uneven. It was written with haste, possibly with a trembling hand. A warning or a riddle, possibly both. He moved toward the hearth, crouching beside it, and examined the interior carefully. There has been burning here, and not logs alone. See here, Watson, fragments of parchment. This one's edge is lined in gold. He pulled out the remains of something that looked like a vellum manuscript, charred along the edges. There were a few still legible marks, inked glyphs like those in the ciphered notebook. Destroyed after the observatory visit? I asked. Likely the night before, Holmes said. And I wager this was not the only item consigned to the flames. He was purging something, secrets too dangerous to be left behind. In the upstairs rooms, the house grew colder. Sir Alister's bedchamber was austere, a high canopied bed, a writing desk, a wardrobe of precisely arranged garments. On the knit-stand was a single book, The Lamentations of Pharisees, an obscure Greek philosophical treatise touching on death, the soul, and visions from beyond. Holmes flipped through it. Certain passages had been underlined in pencil, including one that read, "The soul is not drawn forth by death, but by the seeing of that which lies behind the stars." He closed the book slowly. What did he believe he had seen, Watson? Holmes asked quietly. And who convinced him to look for it in the first place? As we descended back to the parlor, we found a small figure waiting just inside the front door, a woman in her mid-30s, plainly dressed but carrying herself with a nervous sort of pride. She clutched a handbag with white-knuckled fingers. The constable stepped forward. "Miss Fiona Carroway, sir." She was Sir Alister's housekeeper. Holmes nodded curtly. "Miss Carroway, I trust you understand the gravity of your late employer's passing." She looked down, voice trembling. "Yes, sir, I do. I was with Sir Alister for nearly 9 years. He was a strange man, but kind in his way." Holmes gestured for her to sit. "You noticed a change in his behavior recently?" She nodded slowly. "After he left the ministry, he withdrew into himself, locked himself away with those books. He stopped going out, stopped writing letters, wouldn't even see his brother when he came to the door. He has a brother still living, Mr. Leonard Dunbrake, lives out near Morningside, but they hadn't spoken in months. Sir Alister said the blood between them was thinned by time." Holmes tilted his head. "Did Sir Alister speak to anyone else, receive visitors?" "One man came, tall, dark coat, foreign accent, Eastern maybe. Came at night once or twice. I never caught his name." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me briefly. "Did they argue?" "No, sir, they spoke quietly. In another language, I think, but once I heard Sir Alister raise his voice. Said something about the veil not being his to lift. I remember that clearly." Holmes sat back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Thank you, Miss Carroway. You've been most helpful." As she rose to leave, she paused and turned. "Sir, he wasn't afraid of dying. Not really. But he was afraid of something else. He'd wake in the night, said there were shapes in the corners, that he'd brought them with him from Constantinople. Once she had gone, Holmes stood in the center of the room, with his hands clasped behind his back. "She has no idea how close she came to the heart of the matter," he said. "Constantinople, rituals, veils, and now death. Do you believe the visitor was responsible?" I asked. "I believe the visitor played a part," Holmes replied. "Whether as a conspirator or as a trigger, I cannot yet say. But his presence is the first concrete link to something outside this house, a connection to what Sir Alistair found or feared overseas." He turned to me. "We must find Leonard Dunbrake." To learn more of his brother? To learn whether the madness was shared or passed along. That evening, Holmes pored over the ciphered notebook again, now with 2 candles and a fresh lens. The hotel room was silent, save the occasional turn of a page or murmur of deduction. I sat by the fire, reading a pamphlet on Mesopotamian ruins, and thinking of the strange phrases Holmes had uncovered as the hour neared midnight. Holmes suddenly froze, tapping his fingers against the desk. "Watson, do you recall the professor's words? Which part? That this cipher mimicked something from beneath the Temple Mount? Now, consider this line." He pointed to a repeated phrase in the notebook. "Gates unseen. Circle unbroken. Calton beneath Calton." I frowned. "What does it mean?" Holmes whispered. "It means what Sir Alistair feared most was not above, but below. Something beneath Calton Hill. Buried. Forgotten." He shut the book with a snap. "And that, Watson, is where we must go next." Chapter 4. The spectre in the vault. The dawn that crept over Edinburgh the next morning was sullen and overcast, its gray skies matching the chill that lingered in my bones. Holmes, uncharacteristically silent at breakfast, toyed with his tea, but consumed little. I knew this look, the one he wore when his mind had latched onto a thread, too faint for others to see, but all-consuming in its potential dot. We were seated once more at the modest breakfast table in our George Street lodgings. The faint clink of cutlery from other rooms filtered through the walls as Holmes stared at the faded newspaper, not reading it so much as using it as a screen to mask his deeper thoughts. "Have you deciphered something of significance, Holmes?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. He lowered the paper slowly. "Tell me, Watson, when you examined the body of Sir Alistair, did you note the condition of his hands?" I thought for a moment. "Clean, surprisingly so. No ink stains, no calluses one might expect from someone in his position, and not a trace of dirt beneath. The nails." Holmes gave a short nod. "Exactly. And yet this was a man who, according to his staff, spent many an afternoon arranging old documents and relics from the Foundation's archives. Curious, is it not? Perhaps he had only just begun his work that day and had yet to handle anything." "Perhaps," Holmes echoed, though it was clear he found the explanation lacking. He stood and walked to the window, peering down at the slick, rain-dappled street. "There's something foul beneath the facade of the Edinburgh Antiquities Foundation. I suspect Sir Alistair was not merely its figurehead." Before I could reply, a soft knock came at the door. A messenger boy stood outside with a note bearing the seal of Inspector McKinnon. "Holmes, unusual developments at the Foundation. Vault disturbed. No sign of forced entry. One item missing, a sealed silver coffer, never catalogued in the public. Records. Mr. Crammond is demanding answers. Thought you'd want to see it for yourself. McKinnon Holmes handed me the note with a faint smile, and now the shadows deepen. We arrived at the foundation just after 9:30. The staff bustled about in hushed anxiety. Mr. Crammond met us at the door, his usual poise fraying at the edges. "The vault was untouched last night," he said briskly as he led us down a stone stairwell into the bowels of the building. "It's only used for storage of high-value artifacts. Access is tightly restricted. And yet one item is now missing," Holmes said as we descended. His voice echoed against the damp stone. "Precisely. A silver coffer, heavy and ornately engraved, sealed shut with no hinges or visible latch. It was part of the Dalhousie estate donation, but never inventoried due to its esoteric nature." "Esoteric?" I asked, intrigued. Crammond hesitated. "Sir Alistair believed it housed something sacred, or cursed. He wouldn't allow anyone to tamper with it. Claimed it was safer left closed." Holmes smiled thinly. "How?" "Dreadfully theatrical. And now it's gone." The vault door, an imposing iron slab with a triple bolt mechanism, showed no sign of tampering. Inside, rows of shelves bore neat records, ancient ledgers, stone fragments, and rusted relics from centuries past. But on one stone plinth, conspicuously bare, sat only an impression where something heavy had once rested. Holmes bent to examine the dust, which was disturbed in a curious pattern, as though the item had been lifted without dragging, yet faint. Scuff marks surrounded the base. "Not a theft," Holmes murmured. "A retrieval." He turned suddenly. "Tell me, Crammond, who knew of this coffer beside yourself and Sir Alistair?" The man bristled. "No one of consequence. Only our head archivist, Miss Fraser, and perhaps Dr. Dundas, though he had little interest in anything not related to his own papers." Holmes looked at me. "I believe it's time we spoke to the elusive Miss Fraser." We found Miss Fraser in the upper reading room, surrounded by maps of old Edinburgh and several Gaelic tomes. She was younger than I expected, no more than 30, with sharp eyes that gleamed with both intellect and caution. "Mr. Holmes," she said, as we introduced ourselves, "I was wondering when you'd come calling. You are aware of the missing artifact, then?" She nodded calmly. "I discovered its absence this morning. Sir Alistair often instructed me to check the vault's humidity readings. When I went down at 8, the coffer was gone." "Did you tell anyone?" "Only Mr. Crammond, who promptly had a fit and sent for the police." Holmes paced slowly. "Do you believe Sir Alistair feared the contents of the coffer?" A shadow flickered in her eyes. "He believed it was tied to the old Calton legends, tales of something sealed centuries ago beneath the hill. A cult relic, perhaps. He grew obsessed with it in recent weeks. I think he believed something was coming for it." Watson and I exchanged a glance. "And did he mention anyone else showing interest in the item?" She hesitated. "There was a visitor last week, a Mr. Julius Gray. American, I think. Quiet, intense. He asked strange questions about the coffer and the hill. I told him nothing." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Gray, you say? Did he wear a signet ring on his left hand?" "Yes," she said. "How did you?" But Holmes was already halfway out the room. Back on George Street that evening, Holmes stood before the fireplace, smoking furiously. The missing coffer. A sealed vault. A man who dies in locked room, claiming a shadow watches him. And now, a visitor with a ring bearing. An ancient mark prying into Calton Hill's past. What do you make of it, Holmes? I believe the game is no longer about murder alone, Watson. We are dealing with something far older, a mystery buried quite literally beneath the city. And the coffer? Holmes exhaled smoke. A key, or perhaps a seal. Either way, it was never meant to be opened. I shuddered slightly. Outside, the Edinburgh fog had crept in thick and heavy, coiling around the lamplight like spectral fingers. A shadow passed across the window, just a pedestrian, surely, and yet Holmes turned toward it with sudden intensity, as though expecting someone, or something. "Watson," he said quietly, "tonight we don't sleep. I believe we are being watched." Chapter 5. A whisper from the grave. We returned to Baker Street in a silence made heavier by the nature of what we had witnessed at Lady Darnley's town residence. Holmes reclined in his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, while I sat across from him, brooding over the fragments of a puzzle that refused to take shape. I cannot make heads or tails of it. "Holmes," I finally admitted. Lady Darnley seemed truly frightened, but her statements were inconsistent, her manner evasive. Holmes nodded slowly. "Fear, Watson, distorts the natural rhythm of truth. It forces the tongue into erratic dance, revealing fragments while concealing the frame. But she did offer more than she realized." He rose suddenly and fetched the telegram that had arrived while we were out. His eyes scanned the message, and a slight crease appeared between his brows. "From Inspector MacFarlane in Edinburgh," Holmes announced. "It appears Lady Darnley's late husband, Lord Archibald Darnley, has a connection to a property near Calton Hill. The house was once the private retreat of an eccentric antiquarian, now passed into Lady Darnley's possession." "A house?" I asked. Why would she not mention it? Holmes smiled faintly. "Because she is frightened of what lingers there, or more precisely, what others believe lingers there." He passed me the telegram. "Darnley property off Calton Hill, recently vacated by last tenant, Dr. Percival Torrance. Local reports of unusual disturbances. Several complaints lodged. Locals speak of ghost lights. Request you inspect at earliest." "MacFarlane, ghost lights?" I repeated. "Are we pursuing specters now?" "Hardly," Holmes said. "But when rational men begin to behave irrationally, the roots often lie in carefully orchestrated illusion. We shall travel to Edinburgh by the overnight express, Watson. I wish to examine this house before local tongues corrupt our objectivity further." By noon the next day, we stood before the wrought iron gates of a bleak Georgian house, perched against the rising backdrop of Calton Hill. It had the look of a forgotten mausoleum, its shutters closed tight, its stone facade worn by Edinburgh's harsh breath. The caretaker, a taciturn old fellow named Mr. Gowrie, met us with a lantern and a key of grotesque size. "No one stayed here since Dr. Torrance left," he muttered. "He was a strange sort, pale, jumpy. Talked to the walls, he did. Always said he heard things scratching at the windows in the dark." Holmes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. We followed the caretaker into the house. The interior was cloaked in dust and silence, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath our steps. A peculiar, damp chill clung to the air. The drawing room bore signs of hurried departure. A toppled chair, a cracked inkpot, papers scattered in the fireplace. Holmes moved silently, his eyes sweeping every surface. I moved to the window. "These panes are scored," I murmured, as if something clawed at them. Holmes nodded. "Manufactured fear, Watson. A clever misdirection. The scores are two uniform created with a metal edge, not nails or claws." We ascended the stairs next, guided by Gowry's flickering lantern. At the top we found the study of Dr. Torrance. A desk lay covered in curling notes and journal. Entries. Holmes leaf through one page and read aloud. The lights again just beyond the hedge. They flicker blue and vanish. I hear the humming sometimes like voices. My dreams are no longer my own. He looked up. Classic signs of mental collapse or coercion. I picked up another page. This one's dated only 2 days before he fled. He writes of a man in the mirror wearing my face but not my thoughts. Holmes, this man was unwell. Or, Holmes replied grimly, he was made to appear. So, he opened a drawer and extracted a peculiar brass disc, flat, circular, etched with concentric symbols and a curious notch on one edge. "Odd," he muttered. "This is no mere ornament. It resembles a cipher plate, and it's out of place in a physician's desk." As we examined it further, a knock echoed through the empty house. Gowry shuffled to the door and returned moments later with a stranger. "Beggin' your pardon," the caretaker announced. "This here's Mr. Alistair Menzies. He says he once worked for Lord Darnley." Menzies, a wiry man with piercing eyes, gave us a curt nod. "I was steward here during his final years. Heard someone had come poking about." Holmes motioned for him to sit. "We'd appreciate anything you can share about Lord Darnley's time in this house, particularly about the late-night disturbances." The man gave a humorless chuckle. "Disturbances? There were plenty. Lord Darnley was obsessed with things best left buried. He believed this house stood upon crossed ley lines, said. It was a place where the veil between this world and the next grew thin. A convenient justification for odd behavior," Holmes murmured. "Maybe," Menzies agreed, "but something changed him. He'd vanish for hours into the cellar, return looking like death. Claimed he heard voices whispering secrets. When Lady Darnley tried to intervene, he struck her across the face. I winced. She mentioned nothing of this. She wouldn't, said Menzies. She's not keen on anyone knowing how far gone he was. Holmes leaned forward. And Dr. Torrance, did he use the cellar as well? Menzies hesitated. I don't think he even knew there was a second cellar. Second? I echoed. There's a bricked-off stairwell behind the wine racks, Menzies said quietly. Old Darnley kept it hidden. I only know of it because I once followed him, drunk and raving. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Mr. Menzies, would you be so good as to show us? Within minutes, Holmes, Menzies, and I stood in the chilly wine cellar, where Holmes, lantern in hand, examined the rear wall. A faint groove along the floor revealed the outline of a once-used doorway. At Holmes's urging, we removed several dusty bottles and pried at the mortar with crowbars provided by Gowry. With a groan, the false wall yielded dot. Beyond it lay a short stairway descending into a blackness that felt somehow deeper than mere absence of light. A smell issued forth musty and sour. Tinged with something acrid. We stepped carefully down the stair. At the bottom, was a low chamber lined with shelves of books and objects. Ancient manuscripts, bizarre artifacts, bones arranged into symbols I could not interpret. The cipher disk, it seemed, had belonged to this secret trove. Holmes held the lantern high. "We've found Lord Darnley's private sanctum." Watson looked there. On one wall hung a large map Calton Hill, rendered in intricate hand-drawn detail. Red circles marked specific locations across the hill. Beneath the map was a locked wooden cabinet. Holmes knelt and examined its hinges. "Recently used," he murmured, "and not by Lord Darnley." He looked to me gravely. "Someone else has been down here, Watson, very recently, and I dare say he'll return." Chapter 6. A Visit to the Catacombs. Holmes and I rose early the next morning, eager to follow up on the latest thread in what was becoming a most complex tapestry. Holmes, after a breakfast of dry toast and 2 cups of black coffee, stood at the window of our Edinburgh lodgings, his keen eyes fixed on the mist that still lingered over the streets below. "A curious city, Watson," he murmured. "One foot in the age of enlightenment, the other firmly planted in ancient superstition." "You refer to the catacombs?" I asked, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. The headlines still ran with sensational tales of the apparent Calton phantom, though Holmes had dismissed the notion entirely the evening before. Indeed, a subterranean realm where the living seldom venture, and the dead, it seems, still hold counsel. We set off shortly after, winding through the shadowed streets of Old Town until we reached a squat, nondescript structure near the base of Calton Hill. There, a wrought iron gate led to a stairwell descending into the ground. Our guide, a wiry Scotsman with a hunched back and a voice like crushed gravel, produced a rusted key and ushered us into the darkness. The catacombs were every bit as oppressive as I had imagined. The air was thick with dampness and decay. Flickering lanterns cast long, tremulous shadows along the rough-hewn stone walls. I felt a peculiar chill despite my overcoat, and Holmes, sensing my discomfort, offered a brief nod of reassurance. "Not far now," the guide rasped. "You said you were interested in the Bishop's Arch. Right this way." The passage narrowed, the walls pressing in on either side, until we emerged into a vaulted chamber. Here rows of aged tombs lined the walls, some sealed with bricks, others still bearing faded inscriptions. Holmes bent to inspect a cracked slab, brushing away centuries of grime with a handkerchief. "Observe, Watson, the inscription here is in Latin, though this side clearly suffered some tampering." I leaned closer. "You mean the stone was moved?" "Precisely. Look at the mortar. Crude, recent. This tomb was disturbed within the past year, perhaps within the past few months." Our guide scratched his chin, frowning. "There's been no report of grave robbers, sir. Not in this section." "Then someone has taken pains to conceal their visit," Holmes murmured, tapping the edge of the stone with his cane. "A hiding place, perhaps, or a meeting spot." He stood, eyes narrowed. "Tell me, has anyone requested access to this portion of the catacombs recently? Any scholars, visitors, local or foreign?" The guide hesitated. "Aye. Come to think of it, there was a gentleman few weeks back. Didn't give a name, but had all the permits from the city. Said he was studying pre-Reformation burials." "What did he look like?" "Tall, with a beard. Wore one of those long coats professors favor. Bit of a limp in his left leg." Holmes froze. "A limp, you say?" "Aye, sir, right noticeable it was." He turned sharply to me. "Watson, recall the caretaker at the cemetery who mentioned a limping man asking after James Rookwood's tomb? The same profile fits. So you believe the same man has been seen at both locations?" "Not merely believe, it is near certain. He has been moving across these sites for a purpose." We spent another half-hour in the chamber, Holmes examining the walls, niches, and other disturbed tombs. At one point, he produced a small magnifying glass and scrutinized a smudge on a stone ledge. "What do you make of this, Watson?" I bent to observe it. "Dirt, perhaps, dust from the tomb?" "No, wax, candle wax, to be precise. Someone held a vigil here and recently. Do you suppose it has religious significance?" "Or theatrical," Holmes said quietly. "We are dealing with a man who values ritual, secrecy, and ancient symbols. These visits are not random. They follow a pattern. I must map it." As we emerged from the catacombs, blinking in the midday light, Holmes remained quiet. His eyes darted across the horizon, where the skyline of Edinburgh appeared like the jagged teeth of a sleeping beast. "Watson," he said suddenly, "we must pay a call to Miss Margaret Dunsmore." "The fiancée of the late Mr. Rookwood, precisely? I believe she holds a key, perhaps unknowingly, to this labyrinth of shadows." Later that afternoon, we arrived at a modest but well-maintained townhouse, nestled in the quieter end of Queen Street. Miss Dunsmore received us in the drawing-room, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her expression brittle but composed. "I trust you will forgive the intrusion," Holmes began, bowing politely. "We are investigating circumstances surrounding Mr. Rookwood's passing." A shadow flickered across her features. "Of course. James was a complicated man." "How so?" Holmes asked, gently taking a seat opposite her. She paused, fingers tightening around her teacup. "He'd changed in the final months. He would disappear for days. I once caught him burning old letters and the fireplace things from his father's estate, and he began speaking of dreams, dark ones, as if something were haunting him." "Did he speak of anyone named Fenwick?" Her eyes widened slightly. "Yes, Professor Fenwick. They were in correspondence. He lectured at the University Antiquities, I believe. Do you know where we might find him?" She hesitated. "James once told me he lived near Dean Village, but he was secretive. He warned me not to trust Fenwick if anything ever happened to him." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he say why?" "No, only that some doors should remain closed. He said Fenwick had opened one and something had stepped through." For a moment, silence gripped the room. Holmes rose slowly. "Thank you, Miss Dunsmore. You have been most helpful." As we exited into the lengthening shadows of the street, Holmes lit his pipe with deliberate calm. "The net tightens, Watson. Our phantom has a name, and our circle narrows. But I fear the next move will not be ours. You believe we are being watched? I know it." And with that ominous declaration, we stepped back into the city's gloom, the shadows of Calton Hill growing longer behind us. Chapter 7. A meeting beneath the clock tower. Following morning dawned gray and heavy, a fitting curtain of cloud hanging low over Edinburgh's rooftops. Though the hour was barely past 7, the city was already beginning to stir, milk carts rattling along cobbled streets, and the faint cries of vendors calling out their wares echoed down the winds. From the window of their lodgings in North, Bridge. Holmes observed the mist curling like breath across Calton Hill, his arms folded, and his gaze narrowed with restless anticipation. "I believe the clock tower will serve our purposes well," Holmes finally said, breaking his silence. He turned from the window and glanced toward the breakfast tray, untouched save for a cup of cold tea. Watson, seated beside the hearth and reviewing his notes from their interview with Inspector Lennox, looked up. "You're still convinced the key lies with Angus Dunbury?" Holmes tilted his head. "It lies not with Dunbury himself, but with his peculiar disappearance. A man does not vanish so completely unless he has cause or help." Watson frowned. "But the footprints, or lack thereof?" The constable reported snow along every path leading to and from the tower. No prints, no evidence of another's presence, save those leading to the steps. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Exactly. An absence of evidence is often the most telling evidence of all." With that cryptic remark, he tossed on his Inverness cape and motioned to Watson. "Come, old friend. There's a certain rhythm to crime, and I intend to catch it before it slips through our fingers. We shall walk once more to Calton Hill, but this time not as observers, this time as bait." By the time they reached the steps leading up the hill, the fog had thickened, obscuring the monuments in pale silhouette. The ground was damp and spongy beneath their feet, and Watson noticed with a shiver how the monument's shadows danced unnaturally in the shifting mist. "Are we meeting someone here?" he asked quietly. Holmes didn't answer at once. He scanned the landscape, then pointed toward the clock tower, where a narrow passage wound behind the structure and dropped into a half-hidden trench bordered by wild gorse. "Just there," Holmes said. "I instructed Lennox to circulate word, subtly, that a certain Dr. Alistair Baird has returned to Edinburgh under false pretenses and will be at Calton Hill at precisely 9 o'clock this morning. If those behind the disappearances are watching as I suspect, we may flush someone out." Watson blinked. "You used Baird's name as bait?" "A necessary deception," Holmes replied calmly, "and one I hope to apologize for in good time. Now we wait." They withdrew behind a copse of leafless shrubs not far from the trench. Minutes passed. The fog thickened. The tower loomed above them like a brooding sentinel, and even Watson, no stranger to Holmes's methods, began to feel the strain of anticipation. Then, at precisely 9, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall, wrapped in a dark woolen coat and veil, her movements purposeful but cautious. She paused just shy of the trench, glanced around, then quickly descended into the gully as though familiar with the terrain. Holmes's hand touched Watson's sleeve. "Come." They followed in silence, slipping down the embankment just as the woman reached a low iron door obscured by brambles. She produced a key, looked once over her shoulder, and entered. Holmes's eyes lit with triumph. "There is our hidden passage." They waited a moment, then approached the door. It opened, with barely a whisper under Holmes's deft touch. Beyond was a narrow stone corridor, damp and echoing with the sound of distant movement. Holmes signaled for silence, and they advanced, footsteps careful, until the corridor widened into what could only be described as a subterranean chapel. The woman was there, speaking to a man with his back turned. Shelves lined the walls, filled with papers, books, and what appeared to be ledgers. At the center, A table bore a wax-sealed document and several opened maps of the city. The man turned, and Watson's breath caught Dot. It was Alistair. Baird, Dot alive, Dot a touch paler than when they'd last seen his photograph, but unmistakably him. Holmes did not move. Watson, however, stepped forward instinctively. The woman gasped and reached for something inside her coat, but Baird held up a hand. "No, don't." Then he looked at them fully. I knew it was only a matter of time before Sherlock. Holmes found his way to me. They sat in the strange stone chamber for over an hour, listening as Dr. Baird spoke with quiet intensity. He did not appear mad, as Lennox had suggested, nor did he seem frightened. If anything, he wore the wearied air of a man walking a narrow bridge between two collapses. "I did disappear," he admitted, "but not for the reasons anyone believes. The ministry's commission was a cover. My real work involved the railway expansions near the north coast and the anomalies we discovered there." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Anomalies?" Baird nodded. "Geological inconsistencies, tunnels that vanished, echoes in chambers that had no walls. The engineers laughed it off. I didn't." The woman, introduced tersely as Moira Farquhar, Baird's cousin and confidant, looked grim. "The men who went missing near those tunnels, their families were paid off. Quietly, Alistair tried to expose it, and someone came for him." "So you faked your death?" Watson asked, incredulous. "No, someone tried to make it real." Baird smiled faintly. "But I had help. Moira knew how to get me underground. Literally." Holmes had remained quiet until then, examining the ledgers. Now he spoke, his voice calm. "These names, the dates, these aren't just engineers or railway men. Some are academics, others retired soldiers. One, a former cryptographer." Baird nodded. "They were all pulled into the same pattern. Each found something, heard something, that made them question their assignment. Then they vanished. Some may still be alive. Others, I fear, were less fortunate." Holmes closed the ledger. "And you believe the trail leads back to the tunnels beneath Calton Hill?" "I believe it leads deeper than that," Baird said softly. "But this was the first step. I came back to find those responsible. But I knew I needed help, and now it seems help has found me." Outside, the fog had not lifted. As Holmes and Watson climbed once more toward the peak, Watson glanced back at the trench, the stone door, now sealed behind them. "What do you think of Baird's tale?" he asked. Holmes's eyes remained fixed ahead. "He speaks the truth, or most of it. But what he believes he's uncovered may be only the outer skin of a darker fruit. And where to next?" Holmes smiled thinly. "There's a man named Magnus Craig, a financier and member of the city's oversight committee for underground development. His name appears thrice in these ledgers. I think it's time we paid Mr. Craig a visit." Chapter 8. A whisper in the stairwell the air within Calton. House had grown heavier since our first arrival, not in terms of temperature, but of something intangible, as if the old walls themselves had begun to absorb our inquiries and were resisting further disclosure. Holmes, ever a student of atmosphere, remarked on it as we made our way down a narrow, winding staircase tucked between the east and south wings, a stair seldom used, according to Mrs. Dreer, the housekeeper. "It is in forgotten corners, Watson," Holmes said, brushing away cobwebs that clung to his sleeve. that old truths linger unbothered by the present. The stairwell was dim, lit only by a narrow arrow-slit window through which a faint shaft of gray light filtered. There was a musk here, of age, of neglect, of secrets not aired. As we descended, Holmes paused suddenly. "Listen," he whispered. I held my breath. For a moment there was only the faint moan of wind outside, and then, unmistakably, a creak, a slow, deliberate sound, not the timorous shifting of old timbers, but the weight of a foot upon wood. It came from the floor below. Holmes motioned for silence. Step by step we continued down, Holmes now crouching near the edge of the landing. As we reached the last step, he peered around the corner. "Gone," he muttered, but not unseen. He stooped, examining the dust on the stone floor. There, smudged but unmistakable, was a partial footprint, one heel only, as if the figure had turned sharply and fled. The mark led to a wooden panel along the corridor's west wall. With deft fingers, Holmes felt along the edges. A soft click, and the panel gave way, swinging open to reveal a servant's passage, a narrow artery of the house that snaked behind the drawing room, according to the floor plan we had seen earlier. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "Someone listens and flees." But what were they hoping to overhear, Watson, or prevent us from overhearing? Before I could answer, a faint voice echoed from the passage, barely audible, as if spoken in hush or prayer. "You said she knew. She told him everything. Holmes froze. The voice, male, cracked and hoarse, was not one I recognized. But the words chilled me nonetheless. Holmes pressed forward into the passage. I followed, my shoulders scraping against the narrow walls. The corridor curved slightly, then opened into a tiny chamber, perhaps once used for coal or linens. It was empty, save for a discarded candle and a bent poker. "They fled again," Holmes said, inspecting the scene. "But they've left their intentions behind." He lifted the poker. It bore traces of soot, but also, he pointed out, a faint smear of red along the tip. "Not blood," he clarified, catching my alarm. "Wax, I believe, but red nonetheless. Someone meant to start a fire." "Dear Lord," I said. "To destroy what?" Holmes's eyes drifted to the wall. A patch of old wallpaper had been recently torn, revealing blackened lath beneath. Documents, perhaps, or old correspondence. Sir Alister's past is trying hard to bury itself, Watson. We returned to the main hallway, where Lady Halberd was standing by a great arched window, her hands clasped tightly before her. She turned at our approach, and though she attempted composure, I saw in her expression a tremor of fear. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she asked. "Voices in the walls. My husband always said this house breathed at night." Holmes stepped closer. "Lady Halberd, I must ask directly now, was your husband ever in fear of blackmail? Or had he spoken of threats made against him?" Her eyes narrowed. "Not to me, but I did find him in the study one evening, several months ago. He'd been drinking, unusual for him, and he was burning letters in the grate. When I asked about them, he snapped that they were dangerous nonsense and not fit to remain in the house. I never saw the sender's name." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Was that also when he began withdrawing from his associates?" She nodded slowly. "He was changed. He no longer confided in me. Often I'd wake in the night and find him wandering the hall, whispering to himself. And what of Miss? Dunstable, the governess?" Lady Albert hesitated. "She has only been with us 6 weeks. But yes, he seemed especially wary of her." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Wary, not fond?" "No, Mr. Holmes, I'm afraid he feared her." At that moment a knock sounded at the main door. It was Inspector Muir from the Edinburgh Constabulary, his coat dusted with mist. He held a folded telegram in hand. "This just arrived," he said, nodding gravely. "From Inverness. A solicitor by the name of Elias Bainbridge claims to have information about the late Sir Alister Halbert's estate and a challenge to the will." Holmes unfolded the telegram and scanned its contents. His brow furrowed. "Bainbridge," he murmured. "That name rings familiar. Ah, yes, the scandal at Lochmere, 1889. He represented a family whose heir was declared illegitimate." Watson, intrigued, said, "So he may believe Sir Alister had a child outside his marriage? Or that one of the current heirs is not what they claim to be," Holmes replied. "Either would provide a potent motive." He turned back to Muir. "Inspector, I would ask that you wire Mr. Bainbridge and invite him to Calton House without delay." "Of course, Mr. Holmes." As Muir departed, Holmes looked out into the fog. Calton Hill loomed through the mist, its ancient silhouette shrouded in gloom. "Things are moving quickly now," he said. "Too quickly." That evening, Holmes and I reviewed the events thus far. The whisper in the walls, the attempt to burn something in the hidden corridor, the fearful behavior of Sir Alister in his final days, and the sudden intrusion of a solicitor with claims on the estate. Holmes stood, walking to the hearth where the fire had burned low. "Watson," he said, "what if the tragedy here is not rooted in inheritance or scandal, but in the concealment of a single truth, a truth so shameful, so damning, that the mere hint of it has kept an entire house shrouded in fear?" I did not reply. Holmes's voice had grown quieter, more thoughtful. He turned back to me. "Someone in this house knows what it is, and that someone is growing desperate." Chapter 9. Beneath the heather and stone, the following morning dawned gray and sullen, with clouds low over Edinburgh like a ceiling of damp wool. Holmes and I stood once more before the grand facade of Dunlevy House. The cold stone seemed to repel the day's feeble sunlight, casting long shadows across the gravel drive. A constable greeted us at the gate, nodding with the faintest expression of apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said. "Mr. Fergus Dunlevy is expecting you in the study." Holmes raised an eyebrow as we stepped into the entrance hall, which felt even gloomier than before. The storm of suspicion now visibly hung over the household. Even the footman who took our coats did so with nervous, darting glances toward the staircase dot as we made our way to the study. Holmes leaned slightly toward me. "Observe, Watson. The staff are no longer just reticent, they're afraid. That in a household such as this is never without meaning." We entered the room where Fergus Dunlevy sat behind an antique desk, his hands clasped before him. The fire crackled low. In the grate, casting flickers across the dark wood panels and rows of stern ancestral portraits. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming," Fergus said quietly. "I understand you've spoken with Miss Shaw." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, and with the gardener, Mr. Creedy. Both offered most illuminating perspectives on the household and your late father. I gather you have something more specific to show us this morning." Fergus stood and turned toward a tall mahogany cabinet in the corner. Unlocking it, he drew from a lower drawer a slim, leather-bound journal. My father kept a number of personal reflections, he said. Though never what one would call a diary, this particular volume struck me as odd. I discovered it in his desk only last night, behind a false panel in the lower drawer. Holmes accepted the journal carefully. The binding was cracked with age, and the pages had browned at the edges. He turned them slowly, eyes flicking from line to line. I glimpsed a spidery, slanted hand and the occasional word that leapt out: threat, ruin, Calton Hill, brotherhood. Holmes stopped at a page roughly halfway through and read aloud. They have returned. I hear them in the wind across the stone. Something in the chapel remains buried, but not forgotten. They warned me years ago to forget the oath. Now I feel its weight again. Fergus's brow was furrowed. Do you have any idea what he was referring to, Mr. Holmes? Holmes closed the journal with a soft snap. Your father was clearly writing in metaphor, but there is truth buried beneath the poetics. The reference to a chapel. Do you know what that might signify? Fergus hesitated. There's a ruined chapel on the far edge of our land, beyond the old orchard and into the gorse. It's nearly consumed by the hill now half buried and forgotten. My father forbade us from going near it as children. He called it cursed. Holmes's eyes lit up with quiet intensity. Then I believe, Mr. Dunleavy, we must pay a visit to that very spot before someone else does. The walk to the chapel took us beyond the manicured lawns and gravel paths into untamed ground. The mist had returned, coiling low around our boots and turning trees into ghostly sentinels. The air carried the scent of wet heather and old stone. We reached a low hill, where the ruins of what had once been a chapel huddled beneath a grove of wind-twisted yew trees. The structure was no more than a rectangle of mossy stones, its roof long since collapsed. Vines had crept into every crevice, and a sagging arch hinted at what might once have been the entrance. Fergus lingered behind us. I've never stepped foot beyond this line, he murmured. My father swore it was dangerous, that it held nothing but trouble. Holmes, never one for superstition, stepped forward with care, examining the stones as he went. His gaze lingered on the ground to the left of the altar stone, where the heather seemed disturbed. Watson, he said, motioning, bring your cane here. I handed it to him, and he used a metal tip to tap gently at the earth. A dull thud answered. Stone beneath the soil, he said. But listen hollow. Something lies beneath. Fergus looked on, pale. A crypt? Holmes did not answer. He brushed away leaves and scraped at the dirt with his gloved hands. The edge of a slab revealed itself carved with the weather-worn remnants of a sigil. It resembled a serpent coiled around a lantern. Have you ever seen this symbol before? Holmes asked. Fergus squinted. No, but wait. There is something like it on the old crest in the library. A family symbol from centuries past, never explained. Holmes nodded grimly. Then we are dealing not only with the death of Sir Alistair, but with something older. Something your father feared would resurface. That evening, as we warmed ourselves in the inn's common room with a modest dinner and an amber whiskey, Holmes sat unusually still. The fire crackled and hissed behind us. Outside, the wind howled down the winds of Edinburgh like an ancient voice. What are you thinking, Holmes? I asked, placing my glass aside. He did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the shifting flames. "Watson," he said at last, "do you recall the case of the Darlington Grange rituals, the Brotherhood of Ashes?" I blinked. "Vaguely. That was years ago. Some rural legend in Northumberland, cattle mutilations, coded sermons, nothing ever proven." "Precisely. But it was never just rural hysteria. The Brotherhood of Ashes was real, albeit fragmented by the time we encountered it. A group dedicated to preserving certain dark traditions, pagan rites cloaked in secrecy. This symbol." He reached into his coat and drew a rubbing he'd made from the stone earlier. "Matches a glyph associated with them, specifically the Edinburgh sect, thought to have been wiped out in the early 1800s. Are you saying Sir Alister was involved?" Holmes shook his head. "No, but I believe he may have broken an old pact, perhaps even exposed something hidden beneath that chapel. And someone, possibly a surviving member of that order, may have responded in kind." I leaned forward. "But what of motive? Revenge for desecrating an old rite?" Holmes sipped his drink, then replied softly, "Not merely revenge. I believe Sir Alister discovered something beneath that stone slab, something valuable enough to kill for." The next morning brought fresh developments. Mrs. McDougall, the housekeeper, came to find us just after breakfast, her face drawn and anxious. I thought you should know. There's been an incident." "What kind of incident?" Holmes asked, rising instantly. "Mr. Creedy, the gardener. He's missing, and the tool shed has been broken into. Blood on the door." Within the hour, we were back at Dunlevy House, trudging through the damp mist toward the outer gardens. The shed's door hung open on its hinges, a dark smear visible along the threshold. Inside, overturned sacks of lime and mulch suggested a struggle. "No body?" Holmes asked. The constable accompanying us shook his head. "Not yet, but the dogs picked up a scent trail straight toward the ruins." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Then we may have been too late. Whatever was hidden beneath that chapel, someone is moving to protect it or extract it." Chapter 10. Beneath the Vault of Shadows. It was nearing 8 o'clock in the evening when Holmes and I returned to the Caledonian Hotel. The Edinburgh dusk now deepening into a cool, enveloping night. The lamps in the lobby glowed softly through smoked glass, casting warm pools of amber on the red-carpeted floor as we stepped inside. A fire crackled in the grate, barely offsetting the chill we had brought in with us from the windswept city. Streets. Holmes was unusually silent, hands tucked behind his back, eyes narrowed, not in fatigue, but in intense inward focus. I knew the signs well. He was no longer merely examining facts. He was testing them against a vast inner latticework of deduction, spinning invisible threads that would soon draw tight into a net of revelation. "Watson," he said abruptly, turning toward me as we neared the staircase, "there is something profoundly wrong about Sir Alister's library. I beg your pardon? Not the books, of course. The collection is genuine, extensive. No, I mean the man himself, his mind, his manner. He spoke too fluently of Rosicrucians and esoterica, and yet there is something performative about it. A man either believes such things to the core or not at all. I suspect Sir Alister lies somewhere in between, and that, my dear fellow, is the most dangerous place of all." We retired to our rooms for a brief respite and supper. after which Holmes requested I accompany him on a rather unusual outing. He had summoned a cab and given a note to the concierge to be delivered by hand to Inspector McAllister. The contents of the note he did not disclose. As we rode through the lamplit streets once more, the old carriage rumbled over cobbles slick with mist. Holmes offered no conversation, but instead examined the small notebook he'd carried all day its pages, now filled with cryptic scrawls and sketches of symbols I could scarcely decipher. At length, we arrived at Greyfriars Kirkyard, that ancient burial ground huddled beneath the flank of the old city. It was a place steeped in lore and shadow, where time itself seemed to linger like the moss between the headstones. The wind carried the scent of damp stone and old earth as we stepped past the iron gates. "Why are we here?" I asked, lowering my voice instinctively, as if the stones themselves were listening. "Because the dead often keep better secrets than the living," Holmes replied enigmatically. We proceeded along the narrow gravel path, our lantern casting flickering shapes among the tombs. Holmes moved with purpose toward a particular mausoleum, one I recognized from an earlier walk through the kirkyard. It belonged to the MacLachlan family, aristocrats of a prior century. The stone facade was etched with a faded coat of arms, a boar rampant, and the Latin phrase sub umbra veneni, under the shadow of poison. Holmes knelt before the heavy wrought iron gate and produced a small lock-picking tool from his coat pocket. I opened my mouth to object, but he silenced me with a gesture. Within seconds the gate creaked open, and we stepped into the narrow, vaulted chamber. It was dark and chill inside, the air close and heavy. At first glance there was nothing remarkable, just a pair of stone sarcophagi and walls lined with niches. But Holmes turned to the far wall and began to tap lightly along the stone with the butt of his cane. "What are you looking for?" I asked, my breath fogging in the cold. "A sound that doesn't belong," he said, then abruptly stopped. There, he pressed against a section of wall that gave slightly under his touch. With a groan of age-old hinges, a hidden compartment opened a recess cut into the stone. Inside was a wooden box, sealed with wax and wrapped in cloth, that crumpled at the touch. Holmes drew it out gently and laid it on a nearby slab. He took out his penknife and broke the seal. Within lay a collection of documents, parchment scrolls, fragments of old letters, and, to our astonishment, a curious amulet bearing the same symbol seen on Sir Alister's ring, the eye within a triangle, enclosed in a serpent. "Watson," Holmes murmured, "we have stumbled upon a private archive hidden, deliberately, but not by our modern baronet. These are centuries old." He leafed through the papers with growing intensity. One letter in particular, written in a hand so angular it was almost hieroglyphic, caught his attention. It referenced a brotherhood that once met in secret beneath the city, beneath the very Calton Hill itself, in caverns known only to those initiated through ritual and oath. "A cult?" I said. "Not in the crude sense. This is more sophisticated. A society cloaked in academia and arcane philosophy. Yes, but their rituals involved sacrifice, and perhaps worse." As we pored over the documents, footsteps echoed suddenly from outside the mausoleum. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, and we fell into silence. The footsteps drew nearer, then stopped. A long pause. Then the iron gate creaked open. I tensed, ready to confront the intruder, but Holmes held me back. A figure entered, cloaked, in a long coat and hat pulled low, carrying a small lantern. The light caught the man's face for a moment. It was Inspector McAllister. Holmes straightened and stepped forward. Punctual as ever, Inspector. McAllister blinked, then let out a breath. Good God, Holmes. Ye gave me a fright. I suspected you would be the only man in Edinburgh willing to cross the bounds of law in pursuit of truth, Holmes said mildly. Besides, I need your help. McAllister glanced at the opened archive. What is all this? The hidden bones of an ancient serpent, Holmes replied. And unless I'm very much mistaken, its descendants are still slithering through the corridors of Calton House. We left the kirkyard under a veil of secrecy, the document stowed in a leather satchel McAllister had brought. The inspector, though unnerved, seemed compelled by the force of Holmes's deductions and agreed to begin checking historical building plans for hidden chambers beneath the house. Back at the hotel, Holmes laid the amulet upon the table and stared at it under the lamplight. There is still a central mystery we are missing, he said. Sir Alistair is not the architect of this affair. He is a vessel. Someone else has resurrected this society, repackaged its symbols for modern gain or destruction. You think it goes beyond folklore? Watson, he said slowly, folk. Tales are often the safest mask for very real horrors. He turned the amulet over and pointed to a faint engraving on the back coordinates. Tomorrow, he said, eyes gleaming, we go beneath Calton Hill. Chapter 12. The portrait and the whisper, the evening air in Edinburgh had grown colder, heavy with fog as Holmes and I stepped once more into the grand hallway of Calton House. The lantern above the doorway sputtered faintly, casting an amber halo on the sandstone steps, while the gas lamps along Prince's Street flickered like watchful sentinels. There was a quietness that did not sit well with me, an unsettling calm that suggested secrets pressed against the walls, desperate for release. Holmes, I said, adjusting my scarf against the chill, you've been uncharacteristically quiet since our interview with Miss Donnelly. Holmes, his eyes fixed on something distant in his thoughts, gave a slight nod. There is a contradiction, Watson, a small one, perhaps, but a splinter under the nail. Something not aligning. About Sir Alistair's final days? About the narrative we've been fed, Holmes murmured. Come, there's more to be found within these walls. We were admitted once more by the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbons, whose pale face seemed even more drawn this evening. Her eyes lingered on Holmes with cautious respect, and she glanced warily at the grand staircase behind us, as though fearing unseen. Ears. I've had cook bring some tea to the sitting room, if you wish, she said hesitantly. Later, perhaps, Holmes replied. We wish to see the drawing room again, particularly the portrait of Lady Rowena. At this, Mrs. Gibbons faltered. The portrait? Well, I suppose that's all right, though Lady Rowena hasn't spoken much of it since her husband's death. I offered Dot. She nodded tightly and led us in silence down the long corridor. The drawing room was much as we had seen it previously, tastefully arranged, with little ostentation. But there it hung, the portrait. I had glanced at it briefly before, but now, under Holmes's scrutiny, I saw it anew. Lady Rowena was depicted in oils, seated against a backdrop of Calton Hill, with the clouds rolling behind her. She looked regal, almost cold, her expression distant, but not unkind. Her hands were clasped around a rose of striking crimson bloom that seemed too vivid against the dusky tones. Holmes moved closer. Exquisite brushwork. Who painted it? Mrs. Gibbons hesitated. It was a Mr. Emery, a society portraitist, commissioned shortly after Sir Alister and Lady Rowena married. He stayed here a few weeks while he painted it. Holmes turned slowly. Would you happen to know whether Mr. Emery is still in Edinburgh? I believe he moved on to Glasgow last year. Lady Rowena might know more. We'll inquire. Thank you, Mrs. Gibbons. She gave a brief, deferential nod and withdrew. I stepped closer to Holmes. You believe the portrait significant? Not the portrait itself, Watson, but the details, the subject matter chosen. Why that rose, for instance? Why paint her with the hill in view when she reportedly despised the view? I suspect this painting is a mirror not of affection, but of allegory. Holmes took a magnifying lens from his coat and inspected the bottom right-hand corner of the canvas. He said softly. What is it? Barely visible under the final layers of faint sketch, a preliminary idea. This canvas has been repainted in parts. See here beneath the rose. A previous object was once held in her hand. He traced the outline with his finger. A locket, perhaps. Interesting that it was painted over. I shall write to Mr. Emery. Perhaps he'll recall what the original commission included. Just then, a sound caught our ears, a soft rustle. Behind the drawing-room doors, Holmes turned swiftly and crossed the room. He flung the door open, revealing a slender figure framed in the hallway light dot. It was Miss Donnelly. Her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment, but she stood her ground. I wasn't eavesdropping, she said at once, though her tone suggested. Otherwise, I only wanted to speak with you, Mr. Holmes, in private. Holmes gestured for her to enter. Then let us dispense with formality. What troubles you, Miss Donnelly? She bit her lip and wrung her gloved hands. You asked me before about Sir Alister's final day. I omitted something, not out of deceit, but she looked down. Out of shame. We waited. That evening, she said quietly, I overheard an argument between Sir Alister and Lady Rowena. It was late after dinner. I'd gone to retrieve a book from the library. Their voices were raised. Do you recall the subject? Holmes asked. Yes, it was about an old letter. Something Lady Rowena had kept, something Sir Alister believed she had destroyed years ago. A letter? I said. From whom? I don't know, Miss Donnelly admitted. But I heard him say, you lied to me. You said it was burned. And she said, if you hadn't tried, you'd have never known? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Where did the argument occur? In the west corridor, outside the music room. And you told no one? I was afraid, she whispered. Afraid of what it might mean. Holmes gave a small nod. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Donnelly. It speaks well of you to return with this. She looked uncertain, then turned and departed without another word. I glanced at Holmes. A secret letter, hidden and lied about. Could it relate to? The portrait. I suspect everything does, Watson. The portrait, the letter, the death. We are circling the heart of the storm. That night, Holmes and I returned to our lodgings in Edinburgh's new town, where he immediately began drafting 2 telegrams, one to the portraitist Emery in Glasgow, and another to Lestrade in London. I've asked Lestrade to investigate. A name I saw scribbled in one of Sir Alister's old pocketbooks, Julian Mornay. It appeared only once, and with no context. It may be nothing, or everything. As Holmes folded the telegrams and passed them to the boy waiting outside, he turned to me and said, "Watson, tomorrow we must speak with Lady Rowena again. But this time we must ask about ghosts, not the kind that haunt halls, but the kind that haunt the heart." Chapter 13. The lantern's final flicker, the wind had begun to howl as night took a firmer hold over Edinburgh, and the shadows stretched longer across the slick cobblestones of the old town. Calton Hill loomed like a ghostly sentinel against the violet sky, its monuments silhouetted in stark defiance of the dark. From the upper floor of the guest house, Holmes stood at the frost-rimmed window, unmoving, his silhouette scarcely distinguishable from the shadows that surrounded him. I observed him in silence, my pen poised above my notebook, unsure whether to record a moment or allow it to pass into oblivion. "There was a pattern, Watson," Holmes finally said, his voice low, almost contemplative. "But the threads are maddeningly tangled. Every path loops back to the beginning." "And where is the beginning, Holmes?" I asked, setting my notebook down. Holmes turned from the window. "The lantern, the damnable green lantern. It is the common denominator present at each critical juncture, first reported by Mr. Percy, then referenced by the dying Sir Alister, and finally seen unquestionably by that terrified maid outside the stables. If I could only determine whether it is a harbinger or a deception." He crossed the room and drew out the battered leather satchel in which he kept what he called his tools of intrusion. Inside were lockpicks, a monocular, a small flask of lamp oil, chalk, twine, and a curious roll of dark cloth. "I take it we are not retiring for the night," I said dryly. "Not unless you wish to miss the lantern's final flicker," he replied, lacing up his boots. We left the guest house under the cover of darkness. The streets were all but deserted save for the occasional distant bark of a dog or the clatter of a late-night carriage. Holmes walked with purpose, his gaze flickering toward every alley and lamplight, every shadow that moved just a hair too. Deliberately, instead of climbing back toward Calton Hill directly, we diverted east along a meandering route, avoiding the main roads. Holmes's caution was palpable. "There is someone," he murmured, "who is watching us, or perhaps following. Too many coincidences. The bent post outside the guest house, the fresh shoe prints beneath the maid's window, and that glint of reflection near the cemetery gates last night." "You believe the lantern-bearer is trailing us?" "I believe he or she has already been near us more times than we know. But tonight I intend to flush them out." We reached the fringe of Regent Road, where a narrow footpath wound its way up toward the edge of Calton Hill. The moon had broken through the clouds, painting the city in a pale, almost spectral glow. The wind bit with ferocity, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and smoke. Midway up the path, Holmes paused abruptly and crouched, examining the dirt with his lens. Fresh soil. "He's been here tonight." Within the hour, Holmes muttered. I strained to see. The imprints were faint, but unmistakably recent. One set of boots, large and deeply pressed dot. We ascended in silence until we reached the upper plateau of Calton Hill. There, the national monument stood like the ruins of some Grecian colossus, flanked by the Nelson Monument and the observatory. The wind tore through the columns like a mournful wail. Holmes held up a hand, and we froze. From behind the columns came a soft, deliberate scrape stone on stone. Then, impossibly, a pale green light began to pulse faintly behind the monument. It was no trick of gaslight. The color was unmistakable. Holmes drew his revolver. "Stay low," he hissed, advancing silently toward the columns. We edged closer until we could see the base of the monument. The green light was moving back and forth in slow arcs, and there, crouched low behind one of the stone supports, was a cloaked figure holding a lantern unlike any I had seen. Its casing was of a peculiar design, curved metal ridges and glass tinged with what looked like green mica. The bearer of the lantern moved slowly, their heads scanning the horizon. Then a sudden gust of wind snatched the hood from their head. "It's a woman," I whispered. Holmes stepped forward at once, gun raised. "You will remain still, madam. Do not run." The woman turned toward us, not with fear, but with a sharp, almost defiant calmness. She held the lantern high, its light glinting off her pale face. "You're too late," she said, her voice steady but brittle. "He knows you've come." "Who knows?" Holmes demanded, his gaze narrowing. "Fergus," she said, "the gardener, Sir Alister's true son." The revelation struck the air like a thunderclap. Even Holmes faltered for a moment. "Fergus McNair is Sir Alister's son?" I echoed, scarcely believing the words. The woman nodded slowly. "Illegitimate. Conceived during one of the old man's dalliances in the Highlands. He never acknowledged him publicly. Paid off the mother. But Fergus ... he knew. He always knew. He worked his way into the estate as a servant, waiting, watching, until the time came to claim what was his." Holmes stepped forward. "And the lantern? A signal?" she said bitterly. "An old family code. Sir Alister used it once with a companion during the war. Fergus found the records, recreated the design. He thought if he signaled from the hill, the true heir would come. Forward. But it became something more, a warning, a call for silence." Holmes studied her. "And you? Who are you in all of this?" She lowered the lantern slightly, the flame dancing across her sorrowful features. "Clara Vaughan. I was once promised. To Fergus before I knew what he had become. Before I saw the cruelty inside him, I tried to stop him. But by then it was too late. He killed Sir Alister when he refused to name him publicly. That's what the old man meant, the lantern. Saw it all. He saw Fergus on the hill, saw him signal. And then he was silenced. A long silence fell between us. The wind howled. Holmes's face was unreadable. "And now?" I asked quietly. "He's gone to the mausoleum," she whispered. "There's something hidden. There's something Fergus believes will prove his birthright." Holmes turned sharply. "Watson, we must move now." Chapter 14. Shadows dispelled, it was late in the afternoon when Holmes asked me to accompany him once more to the drawing-room of Calton House. The wind outside had grown more sullen, brushing against the windows with impatient taps, and the sky hung heavy with an impending storm. Sir Alister, seated in his leather armchair by the fireplace, wore the look of a man both wary and waiting. Lady Isla was not present. "I believe it is time," Holmes began, steepling his fingers. that the shadows over Calton Hill were dispelled once and for all. Sir Alister flinched slightly, though he composed himself quickly. Inspector Lennox, freshly arrived, stood by the doorway, notebook in hand. Miss Marjorie Firth and the gardener, Angus Dempsey, sat off to the side, exchanging nervous glances. Rose and stepped to the center of the room. Let us, for clarity's sake, lay the facts bare. Mr. Edgar Brim was not murdered out of passion, nor revenge, but fear. He had discovered something which made him dangerous to the very people who had cause to hide a particular truth. A truth, Holmes said, turning slightly, tied not to blackmail, as we first suspected, but to a long-buried scandal involving this house. Sir Alister's grip tightened on the arms of his chair. Years ago, Holmes continued, when Sir Alister's first wife, Margaret, died under mysterious circumstances, the inquest ruled it an unfortunate fall from the east balcony. Yet certain inconsistencies remained, chiefly a missing letter that was never entered into the court record. A letter Margaret had written shortly before her death, addressed to a local solicitor. A letter that alleged Sir Alister had been conducting an affair with Isla Munro, who was at the time her lady's companion. There was a collective intake of breath. Sir Alister went pale. Holmes continued, now pacing slowly. Miss Munro, now Lady Isla, was dismissed quietly, and shortly thereafter Margaret was dead. Convenient, if tragic. But what went unspoken was that the gardener, Mr. Dempsey, discovered the letter in the hedgerow, likely discarded after being intercepted. Rather than destroy it, he kept it, unsure of its significance. Years later, it came into the hands of Mr. Brim through Miss Firth, who had taken it from Dempsey's cottage after he fell ill last winter. Miss Firth's hand went to her mouth. Mr. Brim realized its value. Not for extortion he was, too proud for that, but as leverage to remove himself from this cursed post. He threatened to go public, to publish it. And that, Holmes turned to face Sir Alister directly, as when he was silenced. Sir Alister stood up suddenly, knocking over a glass on the side table. That's preposterous. You have no proof. I have motive, means, and now opportunity, Holmes interrupted coldly. The poker used to kill Brim was handled with gloves, but a curious oil was found on the haft linseed and ash, both traceable to the potting shed where you claimed never to have been. Moreover, your riding boots showed peat residue, not from your own estate, but from the raised embankment behind the vicarage, where the discarded gloves were found. Your story about being away with the groundskeeper at the time of the murder does not hold. The man was seen drinking alone at the Red Hart. Sir Alister's expression collapsed into something strangely weary. He confronted you in your study, Holmes said, his voice low. He told you he intended to expose the truth. You struck him, not out of rage, but cold resolve. Then you staged the scene in the library, dragging his body there to give the appearance of an outside intruder. The fire crackled loudly in. The silence that followed, Inspector Lennox stepped forward. Sir Alister, I must ask you to come with me. Lady Isla appeared in the doorway at that moment, as though summoned by fate. Her gaze fell on her husband, and she stopped short. Was never supposed to go this far, she whispered. I warned you. Sir Alister's shoulders slumped. Holmes did not speak again until the constable led the baronet away, his footsteps echoing with grim finality. Epilogue: several days later, Holmes and I stood once more atop Calton Hill, the spires of Edinburgh piercing the pale sky behind us. Such tragedies are rarely born from a single act. "Watson," Holmes remarked, his eyes on the mist-wreathed city. "They are the culmination of buried secrets, misjudged loyalties, and the illusion that time can erase guilt." "And Brim?" I asked. "He sought only to escape the very thing that ensnared him. Ironically, it was his desire to leave that sealed his fate." We watched the wind stir the grasses, the shadow of the city falling long across the slopes. "Evil, when left unspoken, festers in the silence," Holmes murmured. "Let this be one less shadow over Calton Hill."